recently deleted history. On January 23, 2026, before most Americans had even finished their morning coffee, employees of the National Park Service walked into one of the most sacred landscapes in the United States, Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. Tourists usually come there expecting stone, flags, and founding legends. They come to stand near the Liberty Bell, to imagine powdered wigs and brave speeches, to feel close to the birth of a nation. But that morning, another kind of scene unfolded. Workers arrived carrying tools. Among them was a crowbar. They approached an outdoor exhibit built to tell a story many visitors never expected to hear. Then they began prying the plaques from the ground. Metal groaned, bolts snapped. Panels that had stood for years were lifted away piece by piece. It was not a renovation. It was an erasure. The display they dismantled stood on the site of the president's house, the reconstructed footprint of the mansion where George Washington and later John Adams lived, while Philadelphia served as the temporary capital of the United States. Long before Washington, D.C. existed, power lived there. Orders were signed there. Policies were shaped there. The first presidency was performed there. Yet another truth lived there too, one less polished, less celebrated, and far more uncomfortable. Enslaved men and women also lived and worked inside that house. The plaques removed that day belonged to an exhibit titled Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation. It focused on the 9 enslaved people forced to labor in Washington's household during his presidency. Their names, their duties, and fragments of their lives had been recovered through painstaking scholarship and the generations of silence. Visitors who stopped to read learned that the home of the first president was also a workplace of bondage. They learned that the language of liberty was spoken in rooms cleaned by people denied liberty themselves. They learned that America's founding story was not pure triumph, but contradiction. For some, that contradiction is the heart of the American story. For others, it is an insult to mention it at all. The memorial itself had not appeared by accident. It opened in 2010, after years of public pressure, historical research, civic activism, and congressional encouragement dating back to 2003. Historians argued that if the site honored the presidency, it must also honor the people whose forced labor sustained that presidency. Philadelphia's black community pushed with particular force, insisting that memory in their city could not remain selective forever. They did not ask for myth. They asked for inclusion. When the exhibit finally opened, many called it overdue. Others called it divisive. That argument never truly ended. It only waited for a political moment. According to officials, the removal in 2026 came pursuant to President Trump's Executive Order 3431, titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. The title itself carried the language of rescue, as if history had been kidnapped and needed liberation. But titles can conceal as much as they reveal. What exactly was being restored? Which truth had gone missing? And why did a story supported by historians require a crowbar to defeat it? Those questions spread quickly beyond Philadelphia, because Americans understand instinctively that monuments matter, plaques matter, museums matter. What a nation chooses to display tells citizens who belongs in the story. What it removes tells them even more. This was never only about one exhibit in one park. It was about whether the United States can face the people who built it without consent. It was about whether reverence for founders requires silence about those they enslaved. It was about whether patriotism means polishing memory until it shines, or examining it until it becomes honest. Court challenges followed. Critics denounced the act as censorship disguised as heritage management. Supporters said they were correcting ideological distortions. A recent judicial decision reportedly ordered the plaques returned, yet the display had still not been restored. The empty space itself became symbolic, a wound in the landscape, a visible absence where difficult truth once stood. And perhaps that is why the image of the crowbar lingers, because tools reveal intention. A brush restores. A pen explains. A crowbar forces something loose. That January morning in Philadelphia, America watched officials use one to pry at more than metal. They were trying to pry loose memory itself. But memory, once awakened, is harder to bury than bronze. To understand why those plaques mattered, you have to picture a vanished building. The president's house once stood only steps from where tourists now gather in Philadelphia. It was not preserved like Independence Hall. It was demolished in 1832, broken apart and gradually absorbed into the growing city. For generations, most Americans passed the site with little awareness that the first executive mansion of the Republic had stood there at all. Even fewer knew what happened inside its walls. Yet before Washington, D.C. became the permanent capital, Philadelphia was the seat of national power. And this house was the center of that power. George Washington lived there from 1790 to 1797. John Adams followed him. In those rooms, the new presidency was invented in real time. There was no blueprint for how an American president should behave. Washington's every gesture carried meaning. How he received guests, how he dressed, how he entered a room, how much distance he kept from ordinary citizens, all of it shaped the office for centuries to come. Cabinet members arrived there. Foreign dignitaries crossed its threshold. Political rivals watched closely. Newspapers speculated endlessly. The young republic studied the House because the House contained authority. But authority often hides its servants. Behind the formal dinners, polished silver, and carefully staged Republican dignity, another labor system operated every day. Fires had to be lit, floors had to be scrubbed, clothes had to be washed, repaired, and presented. Horses had to be managed, meals had to be prepared and served with precision. Guests expected refinement, and refinement requires invisible work. Much of that work was done by enslaved people owned by George Washington. This is the contradiction many textbooks once rushed past. America had fought a revolution against monarchy and proclaimed that liberty was the natural right of mankind. Yet the first president brought enslaved human beings into the capital and relied on them in the home, where the symbols of national freedom were performed. The president's house was therefore two buildings at once. Publicly, it was a temple of Republican virtue. Privately, it was a site of coercion. Publicly, it represented independence. Privately, some residents had no legal control over their own bodies, movement, wages, or future. This dual reality was not unusual in the early republic. It was common, but the House makes the contradiction impossible to ignore because it sat so close to the Liberty Bell, one of the nation's most cherished icons. Imagine hearing speeches about freedom within walking distance of people denied freedom entirely. Philadelphia itself added another layer of tension. Pennsylvania had begun gradual abolition in 1780, making it one of the more anti-slavery jurisdictions in the new nation. Slavery still existed there in complex legal forms, but the state represented a different direction than Virginia. Washington was therefore not simply living in a slave society among slaveholders. He was living in a city where the future of slavery was contested. Every carriage ride through Philadelphia exposed that tension. Free black communities lived there. Abolitionist voices circulated there. Legal risks existed there. The mansion became a frontier line between old plantation power and emerging northern resistance. The physical structure also reflected hierarchy. Grand rooms welcomed elite visitors, while workspaces and servant quarters were organized to support comfort above. Architecture often tells social truth more honestly than speeches do. In houses like this, elegance on one floor depended on hidden strain below or behind it. The nation's first household was no exception. Washington was intensely conscious of image. He understood ceremony, symbolism, and status. He wanted the presidency respected, not mocked as weak. That required order. It required discipline. It required a domestic machine that functioned smoothly. Enslaved labor helped create that machine. Later generations preferred to remember the polished front stage rather than the human course backstage. When the building disappeared in the 19th century, forgetting became easier. No walls remained to provoke questions. No preserved bedrooms forced schoolchildren to ask who cleaned them. No original dining room displayed who carried the trays. Demolition can erase stone, but it can also erase accountability. That is why the rediscovery of the site became so important in the modern era. Archaeologists, historians, and activists insisted that if America marked where presidents lived, it must also mark who served there without freedom. The ground itself had become evidence. The president's house was not merely where liberty's leader slept, it was where liberty's limits were exposed. And once that truth was placed into public view, some Americans felt enriched by a fuller story, while others felt betrayed by it. But history does not become false because it is uncomfortable. The house where Washington lived was also a house where chains, fear, and forced labor lived. To tell only one side is not patriotism. It is interior decoration for memory. They were not symbols when they lived there. They were not exhibits, not plaques, not names etched into metal for visitors to pause and reflect upon. They were human beings moving quietly through the president's house, their lives structured by commands they did not choose. Historians have identified 9 enslaved individuals who served in George Washington's Philadelphia household, and recovering their identities required painstaking work digging through letters, financial records, and fragments left behind by a system that rarely documented the enslaved with care. Their names still echo through the archive: Oney Judge, Hercules, Mole, Austin, Giles, Paris, Christopher Shields, Richmond, and Joe. Each name is a doorway into a life that unfolded in the shadow of power. They rose early. They worked long. They lived under constant surveillance, not just by Washington himself, but by the expectations of a household that demanded perfection. Because this was not just any home, it was the president's home. Mistakes carried consequences. Visibility carried risk. Silence was often survival. Some worked as personal attendants, close enough to observe the rhythms of leadership. Christopher Shields, for example, served as Washington's valet, assisting him with dressing, grooming, and daily routines. That proximity created a strange intimacy. He would have seen the president at his most unguarded, moments the public would never witness. And yet that closeness did not translate into freedom. It reinforced dependence. Others labored in kitchens, stables, and behind the scenes. Hercules, Washington's enslaved chef, became known even beyond the household for his culinary skill. In a different life, he might have been celebrated as a master of his craft, perhaps even wealthy. Instead, his talent enriched a system that denied him ownership of his own labor. There is something deeply American in that contradiction: a country that praises excellence while ignoring who controls its rewards. Then there was Oney Judge, one of the most documented individuals among them, not because she was granted a voice, but because she refused to remain silent forever. As Martha Washington's personal attendant, she lived close to the First Lady, navigating a world of appearances and expectations. She dressed her, traveled with her, observed her. She understood the household perhaps better than anyone who was not free, and that understanding would eventually shape her decision to escape. But at this stage, inside the Philadelphia house, escape was still only a possibility, not yet a reality. Daily life for the enslaved in the president's house existed in a constant balancing act. Philadelphia was not Virginia. The city contained free black residents, abolitionists, and a legal environment that made slavery less secure. The streets outside offered glimpses of a different existence, one where black individuals could walk without direct ownership, where communities formed outside the plantation system. For those inside the house, that contrast must have been both hopeful and dangerous. Hope can inspire action. It can also invite punishment. Washington was aware of this tension. He understood that Philadelphia was not simply another location, it was a place where the institution that sustained his household faced legal and moral pressure. That awareness shaped how the enslaved were managed, monitored, and moved. Their presence in the house was not static, it was carefully controlled. Even moments of relative trust, running errands, Accompanying members of the household into the city carried underlying risk. The line between duty and defiance could be crossed in an instant. And yet, despite the constraints, these individuals were not passive figures. They formed relationships. They shared information. They developed strategies, however limited, to navigate their reality. Historians caution against imagining enslaved people only as victims without agency. Agency existed, but it operated within brutal limits, choosing when to speak, when to remain silent, when to comply, when to resist in small ways. These were decisions made daily. These were acts of survival. The president's house, then, was not only a site of national leadership, it was a microcosm of early America's deepest conflict. Inside its walls lived a group of people who embodied the nation's contradiction more clearly than any speech ever could. Above them, the ideals of liberty were discussed, refined, and projected outward to the world. Around them, those ideals stopped short. That is why the exhibit removed in 2026 mattered so much. It did not invent these lives. It recovered them. It took individuals who had been buried beneath centuries of selective memory and placed them back into the national story. It forced visitors to confront a simple but unsettling truth. The founding of the United States was not experienced equally by everyone who lived through it. Some built the nation, others were built into it, and the difference between those two realities is where the real story begins. There was a clock quietly ticking beneath the polished surface of the president's house, and George Washington knew it. It wasn't a clock on the wall. It was a legal deadline: 6 months. Under Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law of 1780, enslaved individuals brought into the state could claim their freedom as they resided there continuously for more than 6 months. It was not a perfect law. It was slow, limited, and full of compromises. But it created something dangerous for slaveholders, a path, however narrow, toward emancipation. And Washington, the man who embodied the new republic, understood exactly what that meant. If he allowed the enslaved people in his household to remain in Pennsylvania long enough, they could legally become free. So he designed a system to prevent that from ever happening. Quietly, deliberately, and with administrative precision, Washington rotated them out of the state before they could reach that 6-month threshold. They would be sent back to Virginia, then brought again to Philadelphia, resetting the legal clock each time. On paper, it looked like routine travel. In reality, it was a calculated strategy to preserve ownership. This was not improvisation. It was policy. Letters from Washington himself reveal his awareness of the law and his concern about its consequences. He even instructed that these rotations be handled discreetly, avoiding public attention, because public attention in Philadelphia could mean legal challenges, abolitionist scrutiny, or worse, escape. This is the part of the story that unsettles even those familiar with early American history. Washington is often remembered as a reluctant slaveholder, a man who privately expressed discomfort with the institution and eventually freed his enslaved workers in his will. All of that is true, but it exists alongside another truth. While he lived, while he governed, while he shaped the presidency, he actively took steps to ensure that the people he enslaved remained enslaved. The rotation system exposes the contradiction in motion. It shows not just belief, but action, not just hesitation, but enforcement. For the enslaved individuals, this system meant instability, even on top of coercion. Imagine beginning to understand the rhythms of Philadelphia, the streets, the people, the possibilities, and then being sent away just as that understanding deepened. Imagine recognizing that time itself could bring freedom, only to have that time forcibly interrupted. 6 months was not just a legal limit. It became a psychological horizon, always visible, never reachable. Each return to Virginia was a reminder. Freedom was close enough to measure, but never close enough to touch. The logistics of these movements required planning. Travel between Virginia and Philadelphia was not trivial. It involved distance, cost, and coordination. That Washington was willing to maintain this system speaks to its importance to him. It also reveals how the machinery of slavery adapted to different legal environments. Slavery was not static. It evolved. It maneuvered. It found ways to survive even in places where it was being challenged. Pennsylvania's law represented a step toward abolition. Washington's response represented resistance to that step. This was not a clash of armies. It was a clash of systems, law versus ownership, emerging rights versus entrenched power. And inside that clash were human beings whose lives were shaped by decisions made far above them. The rotations also created moments of risk for Washington that he could not fully control. Travel meant exposure. Movement meant unpredictability. Every journey between states opened the possibility that someone might not return, that someone might disappear into the growing network of free black communities and abolitionist allies, that someone might choose a different future. And that fear was not hypothetical. It would soon become reality. What makes this system particularly revealing is how it complicates the moral narrative often attached to the founding generation. It forces us to move beyond simple categories: hero or hypocrite, visionary or oppressor, and confront a more uncomfortable reality. Washington was both a builder of a republic grounded in liberty and a man who engineered systems to deny liberty to those he owned. These truths do not cancel each other out. They coexist, and it is precisely that coexistence that defines the early United States. The exhibit removed in 2026 did not invent this story. It presented it. It showed visitors that the founding of the nation was not only a story of ideals proclaimed, but also of systems maintained, that behind every declaration of freedom, there were mechanisms ensuring that freedom remained selective. The 6-month rule and the rotation system are not footnotes. They are central to understanding how American slavery adapted, survived, and embedded itself even within spaces that claimed to move beyond it. Because in the end, the question is not whether Washington knew what he was doing. The evidence suggests he did. The question is what we do with that knowledge now. Do we smooth it over in the name of unity? Or do we examine it fully, even when it disrupts the story we thought we knew? The answer to that question is still being written. If the president's house was a stage where power performed itself, then Oney Judge was one of its quiet observers, watching, learning, waiting. She was born into slavery, like her mother before her, and became the personal attendant of Martha Washington. That role placed her closer to the center of elite life the most enslaved people would ever experience. She dressed Martha, traveled with her, managed clothing, and moved through spaces where decisions were made and appearances carefully controlled. She saw the rituals of authority up close, the rehearsed grace, the measured words, the choreography of leadership. But proximity did not mean privilege. It meant pressure. It meant constant expectation. And it meant living in a world where every act of service reinforced a truth she could not ignore. She was not free. Philadelphia changed that awareness. Unlike Virginia, the city held a visible population of free black residents. There were churches, communities, and networks that existed outside the plantation system. For someone like Oney, that visibility mattered. It made freedom real, not abstract, not theoretical, but present, walkable, reachable. And that changed everything. Because once freedom becomes imaginable, it becomes dangerous to those who deny it. By the mid-1790s, Oney Judge understood the system she lived inside. She knew about the 6-month rule. She saw people rotated in and out to prevent emancipation. She understood that any hope of legal freedom would be cut short by design. That knowledge did not crush her. It clarified her choices. She would not wait for permission. She would not rely on gradual laws or distant promises. She would leave. In 1796, as Martha Washington prepared for a trip, Oney made her decision. Timing was everything. Moments of movement, packing, travel, distraction created small openings in a tightly controlled environment, and she took one. She slipped away from the president's house and disappeared into the city. No dramatic confrontation, no speech, just absence. But absence, in a system built on control, is a form of rebellion. News of her escape reached the Washingtons quickly. For them, this was not just a personal loss, it was a challenge to authority. If one enslaved person could escape, others might follow. If the president could not maintain control within his own household, what did that signal to the nation? Washington responded, as many slaveholders did. He sought to recover what he considered his property. Letters were sent. Efforts were made to locate her. The language used in these communications is revealing, calm, administrative, almost detached. But beneath it was urgency. Oney Judge had crossed a line that could not be easily undone. She had transformed from a servant into a fugitive, from an asset into a threat. What makes her story extraordinary is not only that she escaped, but that she remained free. She eventually made her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, far from the immediate reach of Virginia networks. There, she built a life. It was not easy. Freedom did not come with security. She lived with the constant risk of capture, the economic hardships faced by free black individuals in the North, and the knowledge that powerful people wanted her returned. At one point, intermediaries approached her with an offer: return voluntarily, and conditions might be softened. It was a familiar tactic: promise mercy to restore control. She refused. Her response, preserved in later interviews, carries a clarity that cuts through centuries. She would never return to slavery. Not under any condition, not for any promise. That refusal matters, because it reveals something essential about the human dimension of this story. Oney Judge was not simply reacting to circumstance. She was asserting a principle. She was claiming ownership over her own life in a system built to deny that possibility. Her defiance stands in stark contrast to the careful calculations inside the president's house. Washington engineered systems to maintain control. Oney dismantled that control with a single act, leaving, and in doing so, she exposed the limits of power. Even the most powerful man in the new republic could not fully contain the desire for freedom. Historians have debated Washington's response for years. Some emphasize his restraint. He did not publicly escalate the pursuit in a way that might create political backlash in the North. Others point out that he still pursued her through private channels, still sought to reassert ownership, still treated her escape as a problem to be solved. Both are true, and together, they reveal the tension at the heart of his presidency, a man navigating between ideals and interests, between public image and private practice. The exhibit removed in 2026 included Oney Judge's story because it forces a confrontation. It is one thing to speak abstractly about slavery. It is another to follow a single individual who looked at the most powerful household in America and chose to walk away from it. Her story transforms history from distant narrative into lived experience. It asks a simple but unsettling question. If liberty was truly the foundation of the nation, why did someone have to run from its first president to claim it? And once you ask that question, it becomes very difficult to forget. By the time the President's House exhibit finally opened in 2010, it was not simply the result of historical curiosity. It was the outcome of a long, often tense struggle over who gets remembered in America and how. The ground beneath the site had already begun to speak years earlier. In 2000, during construction of the Liberty Bell Center, archaeologists uncovered remnants of the long-demolished President's House, foundations, fragments, physical proof that the nation's first executive residence had stood exactly where millions of visitors walked each year without knowing. That discovery forced a decision. Would this site tell the full story, or only the comfortable version? At first, the answer seemed predictable. Plans focused primarily on Washington, Adams, and the symbolism of early American leadership. The narrative followed a familiar path: founding fathers, constitutional beginnings, the birth of democracy. But historians and community activists, especially within Philadelphia's black community, recognized what was missing. They knew that the story of that house could not be told honestly without including the enslaved people who lived and worked there, and they refused to let that absence continue. Public meetings grew heated. Scholars presented evidence. Activists organized. The debate expanded beyond academic circles into civic life. This was no longer just about interpretation, it was about recognition. The argument was simple but powerful. If the site honors the presidency, it must also honor those whose labor sustained it. Anything less would be historical omission, dressed up as patriotism. In 2003, the issue reached Congress. The House of Representatives urged the National Park Service to ensure that the enslaved individuals connected to the President's house were properly commemorated. That moment marked a shift. What had been a local dispute became a national question. The federal government was now involved in deciding how America would remember its own origins. The process that followed was not smooth. Designing a memorial that addressed slavery at the literal doorstep of the Liberty Bell, an icon of freedom, was inherently controversial. Some feared it would overshadow the founding narrative. Others argued that it would complete it. Architects, historians, and community representatives worked through competing visions. What emerged was not a traditional monument, but an interpretive exhibit, open air, accessible, and intentionally confronting. When the Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation exhibit opened in 2010, it did something rare. It placed contradiction at the center of the story. Visitors standing at the site could see the outline of the President's house, read about Washington's leadership, and at the same time learn about the 9 enslaved individuals who lived there. The design did not separate these narratives. It intertwined them. That choice was deliberate, because the truth was intertwined. The exhibit included detailed panels explaining Washington's rotation system, the legal context of Pennsylvania's gradual abolition, and the personal stories of individuals like Oney Judge and Hercules. It invited visitors to reflect, not just observe. It asked them to consider how a nation built on liberty could also sustain slavery and how those realities shaped each other. For many historians, this was a breakthrough in public history. It moved beyond celebration into complexity. It treated the public not as passive consumers of myth, but as participants in understanding. Philadelphia's black community, which had pushed for recognition from the beginning, saw it as a long overdue acknowledgement. It was not closure, it was visibility, but not everyone welcomed it. Critics argued that the exhibit imposed modern values on the past, that it judged historical figures by standards they did not share. Others felt it disrupted a sense of national pride, introducing discomfort into spaces traditionally associated with unity and inspiration. These criticisms were not new. They echoed earlier debates over how to teach slavery, how to interpret the Civil War, how to present the lives of the founding generation. The President's House exhibit became another front in that ongoing cultural conflict. What made it different was its location. This was not a distant plantation site or a regional museum. It was at the heart of the nation's symbolic landscape. Within sight of the Liberty Bell, the message was unavoidable. The story of American freedom and the story of American slavery are separate chapters. They are the same chapter, told from different perspectives. For over a decade, millions of visitors encountered that message. Some paused briefly, others lingered. School groups, tourists, scholars, and locals all passed through, each bringing their own assumptions and leaving with questions. That is what public history, at its best, is supposed to do. It does not dictate what to think. It expands what is known. And then, in 2026, the exhibit was pried from the ground. The years of research, debate, design, and community effort were reduced, in a matter of hours, to absence, which raises a deeper question. If it took decades to build a more complete memory, how quickly can that memory be undone? And perhaps more importantly, who decides? By the time the President's House exhibit stood fully installed, the battle over its existence had already begun. It did not start in 2026. It started the moment the story changed, because for generations, American public memory had been carefully curated, polished, simplified, and arranged to inspire unity. The Founding Fathers were presented as near mythic figures, their flaws softened, their contradictions minimized. This was not accidental. It was a choice. A nation, especially a young one, often tells itself stories that strengthen identity rather than complicate it. But the exhibit in Philadelphia disrupted that tradition. It did not remove Washington from the story. It placed him in a fuller one, and that distinction made all the difference. For some visitors, the experience was transformative. Standing near the Liberty Bell, reading about enslaved individuals living just steps away from one of the most powerful symbols of freedom, created a kind of cognitive dissonance that could not be easily resolved. Teachers brought students and watched as familiar narratives shifted. Historians pointed to the exhibit as a model for integrating difficult truths into national storytelling. It was not about diminishing the founding, it was about understanding it. But for others, that same experience felt like an attack, not because the facts were new. Many had existed in academic circles for decades, but because they were now public, visible, unavoidable. What had once been contained in books and classrooms was now part of a national landmark, and that visibility changed the stakes. Critics argued that the exhibit reframed the founding in a negative light, that it emphasized failure over achievement. They questioned whether it was appropriate to foreground slavery of a space associated with independence and unity. Some went further, suggesting that such interpretations were driven by modern political agendas rather than historical necessity. These arguments gained traction in a broader cultural environment already polarized over how history should be taught and remembered. Across the United States, debates intensified over school curricula, monuments, and national identity. Terms like revisionist history and patriotic education entered public discourse, often used less as analytical tools and more as political weapons. The President's House exhibit became part of this larger struggle. It was no longer just a local installation. It was a symbol. Supporters defended it as an essential correctional way to bring marginalized voices into the national narrative. They argued that acknowledging slavery within the founding story did not weaken America. It made it more honest. They pointed out that many of the founders themselves recognized contradictions in the system they helped create. To ignore those contradictions, they said, was to misunderstand the nation entirely. Opponents, however, framed the issue differently. They saw the exhibit as part of a trend that, in their view, focused too heavily on America's failures. They worried that emphasizing slavery at foundational sites would erode national pride, particularly among younger generations. For them, the question was not whether slavery existed, it clearly did, but how prominently it should be featured in the story of the nation's birth. This divide reflects a deeper tension that has shaped American memory for over a century. After the Civil War, for example, the Lost Cause narrative in the South reframed the conflict, minimizing slavery and emphasizing states' rights and regional honor. That reinterpretation influenced textbooks, monuments, and public consciousness for decades. Similarly, the experiences of Native Americans, immigrant laborers, and other marginalized groups were often sidelined in favor of more cohesive national myths. The struggle over the President's House exhibit fits into this pattern. It is part of an ongoing negotiation over whose stories are told, whose are minimized, and how those choices shape identity. What makes this moment distinct is the speed and scale at which these debates now unfold. Media coverage, political rhetoric, and public opinion amplify conflicts that might once have remained localized. A decision made in Philadelphia can resonate nationwide within hours, and that amplification can turn historical interpretation into political flashpoint. By the time Executive Order 3431 was issued in 2026, the groundwork had already been laid. The exhibit had been debated, defended, criticized, and contextualized for over a decade. Its removal did not create controversy, it reignited it. Because what was at stake was never just the physical presence of plaques, it was the principle behind them. Can a nation revise its public memory as new evidence and perspectives emerge? Or must it protect established narratives, even when they are incomplete? The answer to that question is not fixed. It shifts with political power, cultural values, and generational change. But one thing remains constant: history is not only about the past, it is about how the present chooses to remember it. And in that sense, the war over the president's house was never really about the 18th century. It was about the 21st. The language came first. It always does. Before the crowbars, before the removal, before the empty space appeared in Philadelphia, there were words carefully chosen, politically sharpened, and publicly declared. Executive Order 3431 carried a title that sounded less like policy and more like a mission, restoring truth and sanity to American history. At first glance, it seemed almost uncontroversial. Who would oppose truth? Who would reject sanity? But history has a way of revealing that such words are rarely neutral. They are claims, and every claim about truth implies that something else is false. Every promise of restoration implies that something has been taken. The question, then, was simple but explosive: whose version of history was being restored and whose was being removed? Officially, the order framed itself as a corrective. It argued that American history had been distorted by interpretations that emphasized division, guilt, and conflict over unity and achievement. It called for a return to narratives that highlighted the nation's founding principles, its progress, and its exceptionalism. In that framing, exhibits like the one at the president's house were not acts of inclusion, they were distortions. They were seen as overemphasizing the negative, placing undue focus on slavery within spaces meant to celebrate independence. But that framing depended on a powerful assumption that history can be balanced by subtraction, that removing uncomfortable elements somehow restores clarity rather than obscuring it. And that assumption is where the controversy deepened, because historians across ideological lines generally agree on one principle: adding context expands truth. Removing context narrows it. The exhibit in Philadelphia did not invent slavery. It did not speculate. It presented documented facts: the presence of enslaved individuals in Washington's household, the legal environment of Pennsylvania, the rotation system, the escape of Oney Judge. These were not interpretations detached from evidence. They were evidence brought into public view. To call that distortion required redefining what counted as distortion, and that is where politics entered the historical record. Executive orders are instruments of power. They do not simply reflect debates, they shape them. By targeting specific types of historical interpretation, Order 3431 effectively drew a line. On one side was a vision of history that emphasized unity, continuity, and national pride. On the other was a vision that emphasized complexity, contradiction, and unresolved tension. Both approaches draw from real elements of the past, but they prioritize different aspects. And when one approach is enforced through policy, it does more than influence interpretation, it controls access. The removal of the President's House exhibit was one of the most visible consequences of that control. It translated abstract language into physical action. Panels disappeared. Names vanished from public display. Stories that had been accessible to millions were suddenly absent. And absence, in historical spaces, is never neutral. It sends a message as clearly as any plaque. This part of the story is no longer to be seen here. Supporters of the order argued that such actions were necessary to protect national cohesion. They warned that emphasizing historical injustices could fragment identity, fostering division rather than shared purpose. In their view, history should inspire, not unsettle. It should unify, not complicate. Critics responded that unity built on omission is fragile, that a nation which avoids its contradictions does not resolve them, it carries them forward, unresolved, into the future. They argued that confronting uncomfortable truths is not an act of self-destruction, but of maturity. That understanding the full scope of the past strengthens, rather than weakens, the ability to navigate the present. Legal challenges quickly followed. Lawsuits questioned whether the removal violated established standards for historical preservation and interpretation. Courts became another arena in the conflict, where judges, not historians, were asked to weigh in on what constituted appropriate representation of the past. A recent decision reportedly ordered that the removed elements be restored, signaling that the debate was far from settled. Yet, even with that ruling, the exhibit remained absent, which raises another dimension of power: enforcement. Declaring a judgment is one thing, implementing it is another, and in the gap between the two, history can remain suspended, neither fully erased nor fully restored. The title of the executive order promised truth, but the events that followed revealed something more complex. Truth, in practice, was not simply being uncovered, it was being negotiated, contested, and, in some cases, physically removed. The crowbar in Philadelphia became more than a tool. It became a symbol of how history can be handled when it becomes politically inconvenient, not debated, not revised, but pried loose. And once that happens, the question shifts. It is no longer just about what happened in the 18th century. It is about what is happening now. Who decides what the public is allowed to remember? What mechanisms enforce those decisions? And how long can a narrative hold if it depends on removing parts of itself? Because history, unlike monuments, does not disappear when it is taken down. It persists in archives, in scholarship, in memory, and in the stories people continue to tell. The real question is whether those stories will be visible, or whether they will have to be rediscovered all over again. What happens when a nation begins to edit its own memory, not revise it through new evidence, not expand it through deeper understanding, but reduce it, selectively, deliberately, until only certain angles remain visible? The removal of the President's House exhibit in 2026 did not emerge in isolation. It belongs to a long American tradition of reshaping the past to serve the needs of the present. And if you follow that tradition backward, a pattern begins to emerge, one that reveals just how powerful and how dangerous historical memory can be. After the Civil War, the United States faced a question as profound as any in its history: how to remember a conflict that nearly destroyed the nation. The answer, in many parts of the country, was not to confront the central role of slavery directly, but to reframe the war itself. The lost cause narrative, developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, presented the Confederacy as noble, its leaders as honorable, and its defeat as tragic rather than necessary. Slavery, when mentioned at all, was minimized or portrayed as secondary. This version of history did not arise from ignorance. It was constructed through textbooks, monuments, speeches, and cultural institutions. And it worked. For generations, millions of Americans learned a version of the Civil War that softened its causes and blurred its consequences. That narrative shaped identity, politics, and race relations well into the 20th century. It did not erase the past. It reshaped how the past was understood. The consequences were not abstract. They were lived in segregation laws, in unequal systems, in a national memory that struggled to acknowledge the full reality of its own history. The President's House controversy echoes that earlier moment, not because the situations are identical, but because the mechanism is familiar. When a society chooses which parts of its past to emphasize and which to minimize, it is not simply telling a story. It is defining boundaries of belonging, of legitimacy, of identity, and those boundaries have real effects. Consider other examples. For much of American history, the experiences of Native Americans were pushed to the margins of national narratives. Expansion westward was framed as destiny, progress, and opportunity. The displacement, violence, and broken treaties that accompanied it were often reduced to footnotes. It took decades of scholarship and activism to bring those stories into broader awareness. Even now, they remain unevenly represented. Or take the industrial age, the rise of railroads, factories, and massive wealth. Traditional narratives celebrated innovation and growth, the building of a modern economy. Less attention was given to the laborers who made that growth possible under harsh conditions, the strikes, the exploitation, the conflicts that defined the era for millions of workers. Again, The pattern appears: achievement foregrounded, cost backgrounded. This is not uniquely American. Every nation engages in some form of selective memory, but the United States presents a particular case because of the gap between its founding ideals and its historical realities. The language of liberty, equality, and rights is not peripheral, it is central, which means that any omission of contradiction carries greater weight. When parts of the story are removed, the remaining narrative does not simply become simpler, it becomes misleading. That is why the empty space at the President's house matters. It is not just the absence of information, it is the presence of a choice, a decision that certain truths are less suitable for public display, that certain complexities are better left unexamined, and once that decision is normalized, it can extend beyond a single site. Education systems, museums, public discourse all become potential arenas for similar adjustments. Supporters of such adjustments often argue that they are protecting cohesion, preserving a shared identity in a fragmented world. There is truth in the concern. Nations do rely on common narratives, but the question remains, what kind of narrative can endure? One built on completeness, even when it is uncomfortable, or one built on omission, where stability depends on not looking too closely. History suggests that omission carries its own risks. Suppressed truths do not disappear. They resurface through scholarship, through activism, through lived experience, and when they do, they often return with greater force, precisely because they were ignored. The civil rights movement, for example, did not emerge from a vacuum. It drew power from histories that had long been marginalized. When those histories gained visibility, they reshaped the national conversation. They exposed gaps between ideals and practice that could no longer be easily dismissed. The current moment reflects a similar dynamic. The debate is not simply about one exhibit or one executive order. It is about the broader question of how a nation engages with its own past, whether it treats history as a fixed story to be protected, or as an evolving understanding to be deepened. And that question has no final answer. It is asked and answered repeatedly by each generation. The crowbar in Philadelphia did more than remove metal. It revealed a tension that has always existed beneath the surface of American memory, a tension between remembering and forgetting, between confronting and avoiding, between expanding the story and narrowing it. And once that tension becomes visible, it cannot be easily unseen, because the real issue is not whether history can be changed. It always is. The issue is how and why. The space is still there. If you walk through Independence National Historical Park today, past the crowds gathered near the Liberty Bell, past the familiar rhythms of cameras clicking and tour guides speaking, you might not immediately notice it. There is no dramatic marker announcing absence, no sign declaring what used to stand there, just a gap, subtle, almost ordinary. But once you know, it is impossible to unsee. Because that empty space once held names, it once held stories, it once forced a confrontation between the ideals America proclaims and the realities it lived. And now, it holds silence. The removal of the President's house exhibit was meant, in part, to simplify the story, to restore a version of history that feels cleaner, more coherent, less burdened by contradiction. But simplicity has a cost. It requires decisions about what to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize, and what to leave behind. And those decisions shape not only how the past is understood, but how the present is justified. Because history is never just about what happened. It is about what we choose to remember about what happened. Yet there is a limit to what can be erased. The physical plaques may be gone, but the records remain. Letters written by George Washington still exist, documenting his awareness of Pennsylvania's laws and his efforts to navigate them. Accounts of Oney Judge's escape still survive, preserving her voice across centuries. Scholarly research continues, expanding, refining, and sometimes challenging what is known. Memory, once reconstructed, does not vanish easily. It migrates from monuments to books, from exhibits to conversations, from public space into private understanding, and in that migration, it can become even more resilient. There is also a generational dimension to this story. Each generation inherits a version of the past, but it does not accept it unchanged. It questions, it revises, it adds layers. What was once hidden can become central. What was once central can be reconsidered. The exhibit in 2010 reflected one moment in that process, a decision to bring enslaved voices into a space long dominated by presidential narratives. The removal in 2026 reflects another moment, a push to redefine the boundaries of that inclusion. Neither moment is final. Both are part of an ongoing cycle. The question is where that cycle leads. Does it move toward greater complexity, a willingness to hold multiple truths at once, or does it move toward reduction, a narrowing of the story to what feels most comfortable? The answer will shape not only museums and monuments, but education, politics, and identity, because the way a nation remembers its past influences how it understands its present and what it believes is possible for its future. There is a reason the image of the crowbar has lingered throughout this story. It is not just a symbol of removal. It is a symbol, a force of the idea that history can be reshaped not through debate or discovery, but through physical action. But force has limits. It can remove an object. It cannot eliminate the knowledge that object represented. It can clear a space. It cannot guarantee that the space will remain empty. Eventually, questions return. They always do. Visitors will ask what used to be there. Students will encounter sources that tell a fuller story. Scholars will publish, teach, and speak. Communities will remember, and in those moments, the past re-enters the present, sometimes quietly, sometimes with urgency. The crowbar, in that sense, is temporary. Memory is not. This is where the story turns back to the beginning too, that January morning, in 2026, when workers pried plaques from the ground. At the time, it may have seemed like a decisive act, a clear statement about what history should look like. But history rarely stays fixed after such moments. It shifts, it responds, it accumulates new layers of meaning. The removal itself becomes part of the story, part of the record future generations will examine. They will not only study the founding era, they will study us, how we chose to remember, what we chose to hide, and why. And perhaps that is the most enduring consequence of all, because in trying to control the past, we reveal ourselves in the present. We show what we value, what we fear, and what we are willing to confront. The president's house is gone. The exhibit has been removed, but the contradiction it revealed remains. A nation founded on liberty, shaped by both its ideals and its exclusions, still deciding how to tell its own story. The crowbar could not resolve that contradiction. It could only expose it in a different way. And as long as that contradiction exists, the story is not over. It is still being written.